Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Clare. I'm with iLink, and before we get started, I want to do a couple of housekeeping items for you. If you are listening into today's session via your computer speakers, please make sure that your volume is turned up so that you can hear everything being presented today. If you have turned up your volume to as high as it will go and you still are having issues, please utilize the dial-in number that was provided to listen to the audio via your phone. If you don't have those numbers, please feel free to chat into the leaders and assistants. If you look down towards the bottom left, you will see a private chat tab. You will see a selection for leaders and assistants. Click that. It will go to all the leaders and assistants in the room and ask the questions. So if you have any questions regarding the number or any questions during the session today, please use the tab for the leaders and assistants so that we can answer those questions for you. Thank you, and I'll now turn this over to Holly Wiltshire.
Hi, everybody. This is Holly Wiltshire with the Technical Assistance Coordinating Center. I'd like to welcome you to Part 1 of our Part 3 series on implementing statewide home visiting systems. And this first part webinar series will be focusing on 2 state-specific leadership approaches. And you'll be joined by 3 presenters today. Our first presenter is Eric Martin. Eric is Cambridge Leadership Consultant and a longtime practitioner of adaptive leadership. Eric's career spans corporate government, nonprofit sectors in the U.S. and internationally. Our next presenter is Mary Webb Martin. She's the project director, state lead for home visiting services in Colorado. Mary has experience in developing, managing, expanding, and sustaining health and human services programs in public and private nonprofit organizations with a focus on underserved populations. Our third presenter is Karen Downs. Karen has been the Assistant Director for Clinical Affairs in the Division of Perinatal, Early Childhood, and Children with Special Health Care Needs since 2003, and also serves as MCH Director for Title V programs. This webinar is hosted by the Maternal Infant Early Childhood Home Visiting Technical Assistance Center. TAC is brand new and funded by HRSA. As you know, TAC operates from 0 to 3 in a partnership with Chapin-Hall, ANSHIP, and WRMA. TAC is funded to provide many levels of technical assistance support to MCV grantees, including webinars like this one. And support from TAC can be accessed through your HRSA Regional Project Officer. Thank you for being here. We're so glad you can join us today. At this time, I'd like to turn the floor over to Josie Ansa, who will provide a welcome on behalf of HRSA. Josie?
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of HRSA's Maternal and Child Health Bureau, I would also like to welcome you to today's webinar. It goes without saying that leadership at all levels, federal, state, community, and individual, is critical as we continue to address disparities and build systems of care for maternal and child health populations. Since the launch and implementation of the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Home Visiting Initiative, it has been apparent that the state teams and associated stakeholders are committed to developing and also leveraging leadership capacity within state programs and with community allies. I have often expressed to anyone that would listen that I evolve more as a leader through my challenges more so than through my successes. Considering the numerous challenges that we currently face in our healthcare environment, innovative and humble leadership is a vital necessity, as our following presenters will demonstrate. Thank you for your participation today and for all of your contributions towards the success of this program. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much, Josie. So today we're continuing where we left off from the last webinar on implementation science and focusing on the bottom part of the triangle here, the leadership element of implementing home visiting systems. As I stated before, this is a part 1 of a 3-part series on implementing home visiting systems, and our next webinar on part 2 will be held May 8th, and we'll focus on supporting home visitor competence. So today's webinar will take 2 states' leadership approaches to implementing home visiting systems. After Eric introduces the topic of adaptive leadership, you'll briefly hear Mary and Karen share Colorado and Massachusetts leadership approaches to implementing their statewide home visiting systems. Then each will pose a leadership challenge they've experienced in their respective states, and Eric will engage both Karen and Mary in a dialogue related to this challenge. After this dialogue, we'll field questions to our presenters that you've been chatting to us in using the chat feature, again, at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And as a reminder, we encourage you to just chat your questions as they come up to us throughout the webinar using the private chat tab feature by clicking on the Leaders and Assistants section. So through the storytelling that you'll hear today, the dialogues and problem solving, we hope you walk away with a little more insight regarding how to use adaptive leadership approaches to enhance your capacity to support successful home visiting system implementation, how organizations, how you can practice innovative and flexible leadership. You'll be able to explore leadership skills, techniques, and examples to bring comprehensive home visiting systems to scale in the context of complex social and political environment that many of you live. And finally, we hope you'll be able to identify leadership approaches to implementing comprehensive home visiting systems, as well as experience in sharing two states' real-life leadership challenges. This time, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to get us started with the topic of adaptive leadership. Eric?
Thank you, Holly. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. I'm really delighted to spend this time with you. Our plan is to do this as a conversation. So I would invite all of you, including you, those of you who will be chatting your contributions, to do so freely. I grew up in Detroit, but I've been in New York long enough that I'm used to being interrupted. So I want to encourage the conversational aspect of this webinar. To begin with, just talking briefly about adaptive leadership, which is the leadership model or frame that we'll use to help understand the cases, the challenges that Mary and Karen will be sharing with us from Colorado and Massachusetts. The model itself was created about 30 years ago at Harvard Kennedy School. And the origin really came out of trying to understand, picking up on what you said a moment ago, Josie, how it is that very committed people, very smart, well-resourced, well-connected people consistently failed to see results that met the level of ambition, impact that they were working toward. So it really looks at this, the really hard work of change and the hard work of leadership. How do you engage yourself? How do you engage your partners differently? So our hope is to lay out two of the ideas from this framework, some questions and things we found useful in helping people make change and bring their initiatives to scale in very complex social and political environments like the kind that I think many of you find yourself in. And our greatest hope of this webinar is that each of you can walk away practicing leadership 5% more than where you started. That wouldn't be insignificant given the scale of what you're trying to do. So I'll start with just a brief framework overlay and then turn it over to Mary, who's going to share a bit of what she's doing in Colorado and some of the leadership challenges she's facing. So bear with me as I go to the first slide here. Okay. So we use this metaphor of adaptation. It really derives from the biological notion of adaptation. And we use that because in our experience, transformation is really not something you see every day. It tends to be a more gradual process. In fact, in our experience, most change is largely conservative. And what I mean by that is that most change processes, when done well, honor history. Yeah, they understand where people are coming from, given their purpose and their history, and then move forward based on that. And so one of the very first behaviors, actions, things that you can do when leading any kind of significant change, I'm highlighting it here on this first circle, is to identify what part of how we currently operate is essential and needs to be preserved and nurtured and grown, and what part is expendable that may have served a useful purpose but no longer serves that purpose because the world has changed. And so how do I understand what's made me successful, what's made our initiative successful to date, what are the essential practices, and what are the expendable ones? In our experience, people aren't afraid of change per se. What they're afraid of is loss. They're afraid of giving something up, some essential part of their own DNA or organizational DNA that's made them successful. And so that decision point of how do I understand what the essential is from what the expendable is one of the biggest reasons people don't change, systems don't scale, and the status quo and momentum remain the powerful forces that they are in the world. And so this very first step of determining what's essential and expendable is critical and difficult and requires leadership. Again, in our experience, most change is conservative. So typically, 85 to 90% of how you work today is going to remain, is going to be the same. But that 5 to 10% or 10 to 15% that you're going to give up will be hard, especially for the folks that have the most to lose. And so that first step of adaptation, as we think about it, is about determining that essential and expendable component. The second step, having done that, is, okay, now we have some space, some room for innovation and progress by stopping doing the things that weren't serving their purpose anymore. So how can we run some experiments, test some new practices, new ways of working together? We use, again, adaptation as a metaphor because the reality is the kinds of complex environments in which all of you work don't lend themselves easily to best practices. There's not, as far as I know, any one expert that can tell you all how to proceed. And so this experimentation notion is really about how you feel your way, how you learn your way into the future, when the future is not only unknown, but it's unknowable. And developing that experimental learning mindset in a group of individuals is a pretty tough piece of work, and that's the second part of adaptive leadership. Having done that, then the challenge is to integrate the new practices and bring them to scale. So we'll come back to this framework, this process of adaptation, as I laid it out here throughout the course of the webinar. But the real purpose today is for you to hear from a couple of your colleagues on the phone. And so, Mary, I'll turn it over to you now if you can share a bit about Colorado's approach to the work so far, and maybe give us a little bit of a highlight or a foreshadowing of the challenge that you face, so we can come back to that and have a conversation on it later on in this webinar.
Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be here, and thank you, Eric. And I can't believe I managed to pull up the right slide. So the first thing that kind of occurs to me when I think about this, one of the essential elements in home visiting programs, as I understand them and as I've heard from our home visitors, is this idea of parallel process. So when I think about kind of what my kind of fundamental personal approach is to our leadership of this program, I kind of thought of Robert Fulghum's poem about all I really need to know I learned in kindergarten. It just seems really applicable that we're working in a collaborative environment. We need to play fair. We need to share. We don't need to hit each other. We need to clean up our mess and not take things that aren't ours. We need to say we're sorry. We definitely need to learn and think and play and draw and paint and be creative as we do this work. And then I think we also need to, remember to hold hands and stick together. And when we go out into the world, watch out for traffic, but also be aware of just the wonder of the work that we're doing. So that's kind of, where I started my own approach. And I think to tell our story a little bit in Colorado, I just want to give you a little bit of history, because we really are blessed and fortunate that we have a pretty long history of home visiting at a state level in Colorado. So we have a home visiting coalition that actually was established in 1988. And for some sort of homegrown models and some models that actually did become national models and evidence-based models that we use today. And then in 2000, we were particularly fortunate and having some great advocates for children who helped pass legislation through the General Assembly to create the Nurse Home Visitor Program. And it's based on the Nurse Family Partnership model. And we actually have a permanent allocation from Master Tobacco Settlement dollars to fund that program. And that program was set up to be administered through the Public Health Department, but in collaboration, yes, even back then, with the University of Colorado, which is where David Oles was based here in Colorado. And then with what we would call now in our lingo a state intermediary organization, Invest in Kids, who did a lot of the basic advocacy work and site development and things like that. So going through our kind of history and timeline, we sort of operated the program together for a number of years there. And then long about, I don't know, somewhere between 2004 2007, it's as if we all sort of forgot what we learned in kindergarten, and instead we started experiencing a lot of stepping on toes and stepping on egos, probably, if I'm honest about it. And that ended up leading to sort of a collapse of the management and administration that we had put in place for the organization. And what ended up happening was the advocacy group went back to the legislature, and the legislature actually mandated how we were going to manage the program among the, with a division of labor. So at that point, the Public Health Department was charged with doing fiscal administration of the program, and fiscal administration only, and then the university and its subcontractors were charged with doing all of the program management, the monitoring, the site development, anything like that. So, that happened actually in the spring of 2010, which is just before we got the information about the opportunity through HRSA for the Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood Program. So we had just begun reorganizing ourselves with this new structure and kind of recommitting to developing our trust and our partnership in order to successfully manage the program. And we did, the governor convened a stakeholder advisory group for the McV program in the summer of 2010 so that we could collaborate with all of our statewide agency partners and private partners as well. And he named the State Health Department as the state lead for the McV program. So we went on from there with our advisory group, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, but we've ended up where we are today. I guess I pull us up to today, where we've implemented a subcommittee focused on implementation to help us with the work. So some of the influences that have helped me personally sort of approach this major collaborative effort from the McV program come from two primary sources. In addition to all I ever learned, all I need to know I learned in kindergarten. But anyway, it's the article from, I think, about 2006 or 7, Government by Network, the New Public Management Imperative. And what I really gleaned from that has been important to me is that state staff have to redefine their core responsibilities from managing people and programs, kind of the old monitoring, get the money out the door to the agencies and then manage the people in the programs or whatever, to coordinating resources among agencies and among stakeholders to produce the public value that we're looking for. And the competencies were very different too, but made a lot of sense to me because they included things like coaching and mediation and negotiation and, tackling the unconventional problems, interpersonal communications. I would throw facilitation in there, but really in a lot of team building to go with the collaborative aspects of the way we do the work now. And I just loved this one quotation in there about we should really be thinking like a symphony conductor instead of like a drill sergeant. And then another really influential thing for me was this the work coming from Stanford Social Innovation Group on collective impact. And the part of that really touched me was kind of a deep appreciation of the fact that no single organization, however innovative or powerful could accomplish this alone, and that just recognizing about the fact that large-scale social change really does come from a better cross-sector coordination rather than from the kind of isolated efforts from individual organizations. So how that's played out and how we've sort of set up our McV program is that we've consciously structured collaboration to tap into all of the expertise available to us. In terms of the state level agencies, that's been really pretty easy and smooth. Public health here in Colorado is acknowledged as the experts in home visitation because of our long history with the Nurse Home Visitor Program. And we also serve as a lead partner for a local foundation grant effort focusing on integrating health into early childhood systems. And then we have colleagues at the Lieutenant Governor's Office who are the ones who administer the state-level systems integration grant. They provide staff support to the State Advisory Group for Early Childhood Work, and they're serving as the lead for the Early Childhood Challenge grant that we recently got. So they've been sort of our right-hand man for the state-level systems work, and we've coordinated the plan that we have for state systems investments totally hand-in-hand with them. And then we also have colleagues in Human Services and the Department of Education who've done most of the local systems building work with the early childhood councils with funding through the Child Care Development Fund. So they were our natural partners, and we tapped seriously into their expertise in terms of developing our approach to community planning and providing support to the local systems efforts. So we've also tapped into the expertise of our state model reps because just like we have Invest in Kids that really advocates for the Nurse-Family Partnership, we also have the Colorado Parent and Child Foundation, who is the sort of state intermediary organization for the Parents as Teachers and HIPPY programs here. And then we have our state Head Start Collab Director, who's been really helpful to us in that, in working with our early Head Start programs. And then we just have a local champion for Healthy Steps. So those are the programs that we're focused on expanding here in Colorado. And through all of these partnerships, and we have additional partners, but these are sort of the most active ones in terms of doing the work. We all participate in our early childhood partnership, and we all align our work in support of our early childhood framework here in Colorado. So we sit together on various work groups and task forces, so that we can all be working together to align ourselves to further that vision that all Colorado children are valued, healthy, and thriving. So some examples of that, both on this slide and let's see, I'll focus on to the next slide. So we have, state partners that have helped us with the community planning process that we developed to guide our investments at the local level, to help them develop their local home visiting plans, and to help the councils develop and implement their scopes of work for systems building contracts that we're providing them with. And then, an implementation team that was convened, as I spoke to earlier, provides just a forum for discussing and responding to all of our sort of real-time challenges that have come up as we implement our state plan. So that includes both the model reps and those state agency partners that support the state and local systems building work. So that's kind of an idea of how we've structured our collaborative approach to the McV program, but I think I'm going to stop here and just kind of leave you with my realization of where we are today. And that is pretty much that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And we're definitely finding that that we're constantly experiencing some variances on what we expected, when we laid out our plan and began to implement it. And truly kind of the one constant is the call that we're hearing to continually adapt and actually readapt when there's additional opportunity and need. So I think I'll go ahead and stop there.
Thank you, Mary. And that'll be a nice point to pick up in a moment after we hear from Karen. In some ways, the more successful you are, which it sounds like you have been in Colorado, in building trust, building collaboration, showing some very good results, that very success can get in the way when you're asking people to reconsider how they show up in that process, how they re-engage with you, what kind of roles they have or don't have. So I think there's some pretty profound implications that success has in terms of your ability to adapt going forward. We'll pick that up in a moment, but why don't we just what we're trying to do here is set the table with Mary and Karen so we can come back and have a conversation about the leadership challenges and draw some generalized principles that the rest of you can take away, hopefully, in your own work. So Karen, let's turn to you now and tell us a bit about what's been going on in Massachusetts and what the challenges that you face.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm thrilled to be on this call, and I'm just going to line up my slides here. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of what we have done with the McV funding in Massachusetts, and just talk about how we have been really focused on not just the home visiting aspect of this, but really promoting a coordinated system of family support across the Commonwealth. So just to show where, what happened. When we first received the guidance, we completed an extensive needs assessment. And since in Massachusetts we don't really look at health indicators by county, we broke down 27 indicators across the six domains that we were asked to look at by 351 towns and communities, and then we ranked each of those indicators and came up with a composite score. And from that composite score, we identified 8 very high need communities and then an additional 7 communities with high need. And we decided that we would implement evidence-based programs that already exist in Massachusetts. We're concerned about starting up new programs because of the need to really show results in a pretty quick way, and we are worried about the startup costs, or the startup time. So we basically chose the 4 evidence-based models that existed already in Massachusetts, which included Healthy Families, Parent as Teacher, Early Head Start, and Healthy Steps. And this just shows a little bit of the map of Massachusetts and how far flung these programs are. And just to give another depiction of how we're directing the funds, the majority of close to 50% of the funds are going directly to communities. And there's another huge emphasis on evaluation. And we are going to be conducting 3 separate evaluations, and that's another part of the complexity. So this is what we look like in a nutshell. We are proposing to support and expand 4 evidence-based home visiting programs, but we felt that all these programs lacked certain elements that we wanted to include in all Massachusetts home visiting programs. We also sort of view Massachusetts, you can't see my hands on the phone, but I'm sort of gesturing here. We see us as moving towards a comprehensive Massachusetts home visiting initiative that's inclusive of many different models and many different approaches, including some of our homegrown approaches that we hope to fold into the home visiting initiative. So we're starting with the evidence-based models, but we're really trying to strengthen and come up with a common core for all of these programs. And some of the requirements that we are adding are that each community have a community advisory council, or that they link into existing community advisory councils, and that they re-look at how these councils function. We are looking at enhanced training and cross-systems training, cross Department of Public Health, Children's Trust Fund, and Early Education and Care. We are adding an in-home cognitive behavioral therapy component that's 15 intensive sessions by a behavioral therapist. New Child Project is really focused on the relationship between all the adults caring for a new child. A nursing component, except for Healthy Steps, none of the other models
included nurses, and we felt that adding a nursing component was essential. We are adding a universal one-time home visit in these 17 communities, and that's to try to link families into services. And we're establishing an evidence-based parenting together group, which is a way of encouraging parents and participants in these programs to network with each other and with their support network. It's a model to decrease social isolation. So all of that is intended to go into a statewide system of building early education and care, early childhood care that is inclusive of all pregnant and parenting families. So what does this look like? The way we conceptualize it at the 20,000-foot view, if you will, is that there are several parts that really need to work closely together. There's, in addition to the home visiting down in the left-hand corner there, we are working with multiple agencies to come up with an early childhood data system that will enable state agencies to share data, and for there to be some mechanism of understanding what children we are serving in the system and what the outcomes are. For example, we're trying to link early intervention data with some school data to show the percentage of children who've received early intervention services who go on to receive special ed services or who may not have gotten into special ed because they received services earlier. We also were the recipient of an Early Learning Challenge grant, which has been awarded to the Department of Early Education and Care, so we're working very closely with them. And the governor has established a youth readiness cabinet, and there is a subcommittee of that cabinet, the Early Childhood Subcommittee. So that's really our link to the governor's office, the way that we try to communicate what we're doing to the governor and get sort of guidance from the very top echelons within the state organization and support for everything that we're trying to do. So it's pretty ambitious. We feel that it's everything short of world peace. So what did we do? We received the MCV funding, and we were designated by the governor's office, we being the Department of Public Health, the Title V agency, was designated the lead. And so we created a very top-down infrastructure governance system to really get the needs assessment done and to see us through the initial applications for the updated state plan and the application for the expansion grant. And what we had was we had co-chairs of the Department of Public Health and the Department of Early Education and Care. And we had all these state agencies that you see here in the gray coming to meetings on a fairly regular basis. But the problem was, one of the problems were that these were really the commissioners or their designee, and they were not really the people who were on the ground, in the weeds, getting the work done. So we created a work group that was reflective of the task force, and they actually did a lot of the work. And throughout the first year, we were working so fast and furious that a lot of the activity took place within the work group, and not quite as much connection with the community partners and the evaluators, or even the national models, as we would have liked. So that got one task done, but when it came to implementing, the decision makers were not the ones to really move the program forward. So we recreated the structure, and what used to be the task force became the commission, and they became more a body that we will report to, inform, look to as a resource, but really let them get on with their lives as commissioners, and leave a lot of the governance to those of us on the leadership team who were an outgrowth of the work team. But still, it was too much work for one team to do, so we created these different teams, the implementation teams that you see here in blue, and this has sort of become the new focus of how we're going to get things done. Within the implementation teams, there's a communications team, and their responsibility is to really ensure communications horizontally and vertically throughout the program and how the program is communicated basically to the families. The National Models team is a forum where each of the national models meets with the state agencies to really talk about how they're maintaining fidelity to the model within the context of the new initiative and how the enhancements are going to impact their models. The Systems and Sustainability team is really the team that's looking at, how do we integrate across all systems? How do we integrate with early education and care, with Race to the Top, with the data systems? How do we look for third-party billing so that this can exist beyond the life of this grant? How do we get political support and buy-in from the legislature so that we can continue this? The training team is self-explanatory, but again, they are working across multiple models and across all 17 agencies. There's a very extensive evaluation plan that includes 3 different evaluators, and they will all be meeting and coordinating on the evaluation data and reporting team. And then the Universal One-Time Home Visit, that's sort of a separate initiative that will be intended to capture people who don't come into the home visiting program through other organizations. It's supposed to be a safety net. So this is how we articulated the direction we are going to ourselves. And this is how we articulate it to really families. And we're trying to put families more at the center, although I see that they're off to the house. This is all supposed to be what's happening within a home visit here. And this is just really trying to put the community partners more at the center of the house, and to really show that we're all impacted by the systems of care. So this is the new graphic that we're sharing with partners. So what are the challenges? This has been a very intense process. We have brought together people from multiple state agencies, and the agencies often have different mandates, and that's been a source of tension. Some agencies are really focused on ensuring that that the health of women and children across the lifespan is protected, and that would be the Department of Public Health. We're really looking for, the social determinants of health and how policies impact people's choices in their health. You also have the Children's Trust Fund, which is advocating for the needs of children. And you have the Department of Children and Families, which is the state welfare agency that's really looking to protect to ensure that children are not maltreated or neglected. So you have many, and you have early education and care, which is really focused on school readiness. So you have different agencies, each with a different mandate. And you have within each of these agencies, you have personnel that have different expertise. And so there's some people with expertise in early childhood. There are others with expertise in maternal health. There are those who have expertise in infant mental health, for example. And all of these people are coming together and trying to voice their priority for having their particular expertise honored and their voices heard. You also have different agency cultures. Some agencies are pretty small and intimate and have pretty level leadership functions. Others are very complex and huge and have multiple programs and have very different approaches to managing a very large and complex government structure. So, and each agency has a slightly different decision-making structure, so trying to mesh all of our different decision-making approaches was a challenge. And in addition, so those are the top 4 points, but in addition, we're trying to integrate each of the evidence-based home visiting models not only into the state agencies, but into the mass home visiting initiative. So that was another source of tension. And just ensuring that communication was effective both vertically and horizontally was a continual challenge. So I'm going to stop there.
Great. Well, thank you, Karen. And if we could see head nodding, I'm guessing that folks on this call looking at those challenges can identify with at least some of them. So we'll come back to your challenge in a moment. I want to pick up where Mary left off. And Mary, I'm going to ask you a question. You mentioned, you talked a bit about this, you kind of gotten people to a place where they're collaborating, it sounds like, quite well. And I think, Karen, you mentioned the various forms of expertise that people bring to the party. And I think one of the myths of collaboration oftentimes is that everyone can bring their expertise to the table, get paid, get recognized, whatever the coin of the realm is, and not have to give anything up. And it really is a myth. So, Mary, I want to come back in a moment and ask you, as you think about that process that you went through of collaboration, what was hard? At what points were you asking people to give something up, perhaps, in the name of progress? So I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I do want to just take a moment now, and Kelly, you can give me a hand here, and pose a couple of questions to the participants on the phone and folks that are logged in. And so the first question I'm going to read, I'll read two questions in a row. We'll show the results and then talk a bit about it. The first question relating to this notion of giving something up. So the question is whether your experience, you being folks on the call listening in, your experience with asking people to give something up in the name of progress, has that generally been a favorable experience for you, a difficult but doable experience, or simply impossible? So take a few moments, and I think Kelly's putting the poll question up online here. If you can't see it for some reason, just chat to leaders and assistants and we can give you a hand. And Kelly, I'm seeing the question. I'm not seeing the options.
Yeah, I think we have a little technical difficulty here. Hang on one second. Eric, if we can just move on. There was some issues with getting the options loaded up. I will get the other ones loaded up for you. If we can kind of move on from this one and maybe come back to that. Give me a second to load some answer sets for you.
Sure. And do you need the answer sets loaded for the second question too, or just this one?
Yeah, all of them. So give me 1 second here. Let me get those typed in. Hold on.
Okay. So why don't we, we'll come back to the questions in a moment. I think it'll still fit within the context of the conversation, Mary. And can you talk a little bit, again, using this essential expendable frame, which is just one way to think about some of the challenges you faced. You mentioned the state staff and having to redefine their roles, and there's probably some other things that you found difficult. So how do you, reflecting on that experience, think about where you were asking people to give something up? And what was easy about that, what was hard, what you learned about what it takes to make that happen?
Well, and I have to be honest, I didn't see it quite that way when we were in the middle of it. Boy, I wish I had taken a class from you before I started this project. But one thing that I can reflect on is that when we were, when our stakeholder group was meeting to develop our state plan together, we did have one big sort of elephant in the room conversation that speaks to this issue. And it was when our most powerful model partner, the one who had kind of had the legislature put us in our place earlier, sort of took the floor and lectured the rest of us on the fact that theirs was really the only model that could, get the mandated outcomes that we're responsible for producing, and that this legislation was really intended for their program, and this kind of thing. And it was obviously a pretty tense moment. But what happened was that people just kind of listened very patiently and politely and said thank you. And then we sort of went on with the agenda. And in retrospect, I think there was something about just recognizing that this person just needed to be heard. And then more to the point that you're saying right now is that, really and truly, in order for them to participate in this collaborative process, they really did have to give up a lot. I mean, giving up their vision of what this was going to be like. And I don't know, maybe there was some intrinsic appreciation of that, but
yeah, well, that's really helpful, Mary. It illustrates, I think, one or two concepts related to this notion. And the first is sometimes when folks are in a position where they feel like they're having to give something up, that they have something to lose, the best thing you can do is just to name it for them. I know that you have a vision for how this is going to proceed. I know it's going to be hard to give that up. I know the kind of pressure that's going to create internally and with folks in your community. Just saying that alone often is enough for people to feel heard and to get past it and move on. And there's probably a million other techniques that folks on this call could share about how do you help people move past that loss. In fact, that's in some ways at the very heart of some of the work that you all do and that you're promoting. The other point that you made, Mary, which I think is significant, is when we think of loss, and I don't want to sound too dreadful here. I mean, we talk about loss, but you can't talk about it devoid of context and purpose. There's no reason to experience any kind of loss unless there's a return on that sacrifice. And so I want to keep that in mind. But loss is a very real aspect of change. And so that's why we talk about it and why oftentimes groups don't want to talk about it because it is difficult. One aspect of that loss, one way it shows up is this loss of vision. It's just they don't see themselves in the future as you're defining it. And then you have loss of a sense of confidence. And this is where I think Karen's point around expertise often comes into play. People have learned to be competent. They've learned to show up in the world, show up in your world in a certain way. And you're asking them, Mary, it sounds like you asked some of the state folks to show up in a very different way, in a way that they're uncomfortable with. And so that's another way it shows up. And then, of course, there's a loss of resource, loss of power, those kind of things, of course, which are not insignificant. So I think that's just one frame, again, to think about the change process. And I appreciate, Patty, your point on the phone, that rather on the chat, that you didn't frame it quite that way, but it's about hesitation. And so I want to take a look at what that hesitation, another word for hesitation is resistance. I want to take a look at that in a moment. But before moving on, Kelly, how are we doing on the questions here for the polling?
We're good. Did you want to ask the question about experience asking people to give up? Is that the question you'd like to see?
Yeah, so let's put that up and just see. Are we tracking our folks on the call relating to this notion at all, or shall we move on? This is a different question here, Kelly. We're looking for the one that says right. So it was favorable, difficult but doable, or impossible are the three options. So let's maybe work on that a bit more, and we'll come back to it later on.
Okay.
So let's move, Karen, to your story, and try to understand that a bit more. You talked about the top-down governance system that you use for the needs assessment. And so just, again, by way of sharing some of the framework here, I want to draw the distinction between technical problems and adaptive problems. And I'm going to move to a slide here. Where are we on technical and adaptive? Let's see. Bear with me here. There we go. So generally speaking, when you engage in the kind of work that you all are doing, very complex work, you can think about the challenges that you face through two different lenses, and these are two different types of problems. The first kind of problem is what we call a technical problem. And a technical problem is where the problem is clear and the solution is clear. The example I like to use is the example of a broken arm. So if I have a broken arm, it's clear that I have a problem. Where there once was a bone that went straight, there's now one that goes at an angle. Very clear problem. And the solution is clear. All right, I find a doctor. A doctor is an expert in fixing broken arms. They put on a cast, things are good. And so the hallmark of a technical problem is that the problem and the solution are clear. And the work, the fix, if you will, can be done by an authority figure, by an expert, by a consultant, whatever the case may be, and you just want them to optimize the execution. Get it done quickly, let's not talk about it. And so as I think about your example, Karen, of the top-down governance system for the needs assessment, I'm wondering, and I'm assuming that, well, we know how to do needs assessments, right? They're not easy. They're quite complicated, actually, but we know how to do it. There's a process, and the governance system that you put in place was a very appropriate technical response to a technical problem. But then there's a different kind of problem, what we call adaptive. And an adaptive problem is one where not only is the solution not clear, but the problem isn't quite clear. So going back to my medical example from a moment ago, if I had high blood pressure, well, what's the problem? It could be the way I eat. It could be my behavior, exercise, stress at work, genetics, a whole variety of things. I could take a pill to bring the pressure down, but that would be a technical solution. The reality is, if I'm going to make any significant sustainable progress on that kind of adaptive problem, I'm going to have to involve other stakeholders. My wife, my children, other folks that are going to be affected if I begin to behave and show up differently in the family. And so that kind of work is more experimental. It's more about learning. It's more about stakeholder engagement. And I think tends to be the kind of problems that you all face, although I have a poll question on that in a moment, which I'll come back to. So I want to turn it back to you, Karen, and reflecting on the challenges that you laid out at the end of your slide, which you can pull back up here. How do you understand what the technical work is, and more importantly, in some ways, what the adaptive work is? Are any of those challenges screaming out at you as highly adaptive in nature?
Well, I think you put your finger on the button when you said that the needs assessment was very clear. We knew that what we needed to do, and we knew how to do it, and it was really the most effective to be done top-down, and those with expertise in the Department of Public Health who knew how to get data together just did it and analyzed it. When we moved towards implementation then, and it's not so clear, that's where there was a lot more input, a lot more friction, a lot more discord, and it got to the point often that the discord was really impacting the ability to do anything at all. And what we were trying to do was overlay a technical solution of developing very clear decision-making matrix, who's the decider, who's the approver, who needs to be informed, who needs to be consulted.
Right.
But even that wasn't really getting at some of the underlying issues. So what we did do was, go back to square one and focus on what we all believed to be true, which was that we all wanted what was best for children and families in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. So that was bringing people back to a center where we could then start the dialogue again.
Sure. Yeah, and in fact, the biggest problem oftentimes when faced with an adaptive challenge is that people will apply a technical fix to it. It's in fact one of the biggest wastes of resources in organizational life. Reorging is a common way that people apply technical fixes to structural issues. And the reason why people do that is understandable, again, because their experience, their expertise, how they became successful was solving problems. Oftentimes their identity is being the hero, the problem solver. And when they apply a technical fix once and it doesn't work, the thing people most often do is to try to do it again, but just do it louder. So if you're ever in meetings where people are shouting louder at each other, it's an opportunity to say, wait a minute, maybe there's an adaptive problem here that we're really wrestling with. And so let's think more about that in a moment. And again, both of you talked about resistance, and Patty on the phone, or rather on the chat, has talked about hesitation. So I want to go deeper on that notion in a moment. But I do, since Kelly has been working so hard on these questions, want to poll the group and just take your temperature, see where you are, and which of these ideas are tracking. So let's go back to the first question here, Kelly, which is the question around people's experience asking folks in their communities, in their organizations, to give something up in the name of progress, and what people's experience generally has been. And Melissa, I'll get to your question in just a moment here. Thank you. I guess I should do this for myself.
No, you've got about 50% of the people. If you're ready to move on, I can share the results with that, Eric.
So let's give them 5 more seconds to click a button, and we'll move on.
Okay. All right. So there's the results.
Okay. That's actually, yeah, that's a nice spread. I take that back. I mean, this is it's a common experience. I mean, folks generally in authority positions like yourself don't see themselves in this role of having people give something up. And so I have another question here, and I'll tell you where this question is going after you answer it. So Kelly, let's put the question that says, I am in my current position of leadership primarily out of recognition of my, and the options here are my expertise, my ability to navigate the politics of my organization, or my skill at disappointing my own people at a rate that they can absorb. Let's take 10 seconds for that. Okay, what do we see here, Kelly?
I've got the results up there for you, Eric.
All right. Again, another common response. This notion of disappointing your own people at a rate that they can absorb is actually currently, at least one of my favorite definitions of leadership. That is, leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate that they can absorb. And what do I mean by that? Melissa, you asked here, what is an adaptive problem? An adaptive problem is one where the solution is not clear and the problem is not clear. And we had an example here, I think, with Karen, where it sounds like part of the challenge she faces around implementation. And they're not quite sure where to go from where they are. And so that's just one example of what an adaptive challenge looks like. I think we have other examples here. Let's see. Bear with me. No, that's not it. But this notion of actually helping people experience the disequilibrium, the discomfort that comes when facing an adaptive challenge, a challenge that they've never faced before, it's one way that we think about exercising leadership. And so to drive this down a little bit more, then I want to come back, Karen and Mary, to your notion of resistance and hesitance, Patty. Let's actually just go one more. So when you think about change, kind of change that you all are working on, there tends to be a point in the conversation, in a meeting, or in a process, below which nothing new happens. You're not addressing the real issues. You're not making progress. I'm pointing to it here with this space and the arrow. And what this axis is showing on the y-axis is the level of disequilibrium in the systems in which you work, the level of anxiety, discomfort that people are experiencing as you kind of go through this change over a period of time. And so you have this, what we call a threshold of change, which is a line a level of disequilibrium below which nothing really happens. Then you have this level of what we call the limit of tolerance, above which there's so much heat in the system. There's so much disorientation people feel as to where they're going. They're not clear on the vision, not clear on their role, not clear how to get along with each other. They don't feel protected. They don't feel heard. It's kind of a fight, flight, or freeze type space. And then in between those two, you have what we call productive zone of disequilibrium. And this is the place where people are working in a different way and actually making some progress. And so part of your work, as we think about it, is actually raising the level of heat, raising the level of disequilibrium, pacing the losses, to use the definition I gave a moment ago, that the folks you're working with are experiencing so they can get above that threshold of change, but not so much that things begin to break down. And this has similarities, this model, to, I'm sure, some of the learning models, adult learning models that you all have experienced. So getting back to this notion of technical and adaptive, the footprints of a technical challenge, like a broken arm, is that you have a high level of pain, high level of disequilibrium in the beginning, and then through the application of your expertise, your authority, your know-how, your best practice, the heat comes down and you return to a level of equilibrium. With adaptive work, it's often quite different. And I'm guessing, even if you look at the work, the Affordable Health Care Act and everything that's given rise to the kinds of problems you're working with, it's not clear when did the problem actually begin that you're all trying to solve. And so adaptive work kind of creeps up on you. And Karen, you mentioned how at some point the heat got so high that you had to bring people back into the conversation. You had to say, we all believe that this is for the children. And that's a very safe comment. It's something people can nod their heads to. It gets them back in the room, back in the conversation, brings the disequilibrium down, and doesn't really do much, in my experience, in terms of getting people focused on the hard, difficult work. And so one of the balances you face as a person exercising leadership is to keep people in this productive zone. So they're dealing with the real issues. They're not too hot. They're also not getting out of the work. And so I just want to turn the question and the conversation back over to you two, and also the folks on the webinar. What was your experience as you think about where you are now, even with the challenges you've laid out for us? Is there an appropriate level of disequilibrium, heat, disorientation in the system that you think you can make progress? And if not, what are some ways you're thinking about managing that and modulating that level of heat? So, Mary, why don't we go back to you, and then Karen, if you can chime in afterward.
Well, I think what comes to mind is something that we're actually facing right now. Since we've been notified that we received our competitive expansion award, it's an opportunity and really I think a responsibility for us to sort of review how we laid that out, and maybe reconsider some of the decisions that we made, even both our investment decisions and maybe some philosophical decisions that we made. Like Karen in Massachusetts, we had determined that we were only going to look at expanding existing programs in the at-risk communities that we were working with. And now, perfect example of that is based on what we've learned from our formula implementation, it might be a good idea to consider one of the other evidence-based programs that's here in the state, but possibly not in that particular community. And so this, because of our commitment to the collaborative approach to figuring these things out, we want to bring this back to our implementation team to sort of wrestle with, and it's likely to really be like opening a can of worms in terms of maybe expecting human nature that some of the advocates of particular models may revert to some level of self-interest in those discussions. So I think, what I'm hearing you say is, that is like a productive zone of disequilibrium, really, for us, right? To work with. Go ahead.
No, I was going to. So this new grant that's coming up really represents an opportunity. It sounds like to raise some of the deeper issues, it sounds like, that have been maybe simmering under the surface, but now they're going to come out in the open. And the reason for doing that would be what? What would make it worth dredging up and perhaps revisiting some of those commitments and investment decisions it sounds like you've already made?
Well, for me, I think it's, I really have confidence in the fact that everybody really does care about the children, that this is really why we're all in this work. And I think that, likewise, I think that people really do fundamentally understand that it takes a village, so to speak. And I think our system is really a village in this case. And I think that if we can make that our lens as we go through this process, we're going to end up with a better product, so to speak. We're going to be able to impact children at a higher level.
Mm-hmm. It makes sense, and I really am struck by the metaphor you used earlier on about being a symphony conductor and not a drill sergeant. Sometimes we talk about this process here that I'm showing on the slide as a process of orchestrating this equilibrium. So there's a kind of symphonic aspect of this work, and it tends to be more art than science, which is a hard thing, again, for folks that maybe have seen themselves in a expert mode, like many of the folks on this call answered to that poll question. So as you reflect, Mary, on your own role, how is that shifting, given the kinds of challenge you're now facing?
I think that I feel called to really quiet myself down and just listen carefully to what's going on, because I think I almost become more of a facilitator of a conversation. Watching for what is needed for sort of the group process, and that's very different from just falling into the more comfortable sort of authoritative role of just making the decisions. Like, okay, if you people can't come together and figure this out, then we have the expertise here internally, and we'll just make decisions and move on.
Right.
And I don't want to revert to that. I really don't want to revert to that.
Yeah, well, and again, the question is the use of authoritative expertise bad or good, but when is it useful? And so what I would suggest is that when you're dealing with a technical challenge, where the solution is clear, the problem is clear, it's just a matter of efficiency, then by all means, don't worry about group process, don't worry about where people are, just get the job done, use your authority, make the decision, and be done with it. But if it's an adaptive piece of work, and most of the time they come bundled in some way, then I think it's a good question to be asking of, okay, do I use my authoritative expertise here to provide answers, or do I actually use it to create an environment where people can come with questions and help them live through trial and error, trying to discover that answer together. And it's a very different use of your authority. But certainly given the convening role you play as a state agency, you have the ability to dictate the agenda, who shows up, and frame some of those conversations. But always having your hand on the thermostat, turning the heat up when people try to bring it down too low, and vice versa. What about you, Karen, as you think about where you are in your process and the level of heat and the kind of challenge you face, how do you see your role evolving?
So one thing I want to talk about in terms of the level of heat was that one thing that was happening was sometimes the tension between the different mandates of different agencies was then translated down into a personal tension between people from those agencies. So, for example, in order to approve the evaluation plan, the evaluation plan had to go to the Massachusetts IRB process through our 24A process, which is our process, internal process of assuring that participant confidentiality is very closely protected. But that was a slow and cumbersome process, and so that was viewed by another agency as possibly being obstructive. And so then it became very personal, and then what was happening was that people were feeling a lot of tension in meetings, and it was all taken very personally, and it was really leading to very unproductive meetings. So what we tried to do, what we're doing is sort of bringing back the discussion to what are the roles of the different agencies, and focusing on the roles as having inherent conflict. And when we could go to the conflict within the agency, we could remove it from anything personal, and it felt easier to start dealing with. For example, it's not that we, the Department of Public Health, are really trying to block the evaluation. That's not the intent. The intent of the department is to ensure participant confidentiality, and there are certain ways that we need to go about that. So there's this tension between accepting that we have a process that may seem long and cumbersome versus just getting a job done, which might compromise. So I think when we took it out of the personal arena and basically said that these are intrinsic tensions, they will exist, and we need to name the tensions, and then we can start working on them jointly.
Right, and one of the most critical things you can do as a person exercising leadership is to keep disciplined attention focused on the work. And what you'll often find is when you ask the difficult questions, and when you confront people with the difficult choices, they'll want to avoid that. They'll want to get out of that productive zone of this equilibrium that you're trying to keep them in. And we call that behavior that people engage in work avoidance, which is shown by this red line here. There's a lot of ways work avoidance shows up, and I would love to have a separate conversation about that with you all, because people are really quite skilled at getting out of that zone. Kelly, point me to the slide here that has the work avoidance mechanisms. There we go, thank you. So just in this notion of work avoidance and how people get out of the roles, or rather out of the work, really two general categories. One is they displace responsibility, and the second is that they distract attention. Right. So displacing responsibility, one way that looks is externalizing the enemy. So they'll say it's not about our agency, it's about the bad guys over there. They'll attack authority, oftentimes you folks on this call. They'll make it about you rather than about the work. They'll kill the messenger, they'll scapegoat. So these are just examples of displacing responsibility. When it comes to distracting attention, these are some of to me, the more creative ones. Fake remedies, right? So whenever people define a complex adaptive problem in a way that fits their own competence, in a way that lets them show up the way they've always shown up, that's often a form of work avoidance. And what you want to do, as you were talking about, Karen, is get people back into that productive zone. They will misuse consultants. They'll delegate work to committees or task forces or blue ribbon committees that have no real authority or power to do anything. Oftentimes they'll just deny the problem. Right? What problem? We're doing just fine. These are the people that they kind of come across as everyone's friend, and whenever they talk, you feel good, but then you feel just completely de-energized. Like you don't. It's not clear what you should be doing going forward. They'll create proxy fights, and there's some wonderful examples. Again, I'm sure folks can share about how you put a difficult question on the table, and then all of a sudden this issue from years ago pops up, or this side conversation or fight pops up. And again, your work is to keep people focused on the work, on the issue, and not get sidetracked by work avoidance. And then you have just the most disappointing ones in some ways is people that show no curiosity, no creative engagement, folks that are just checked out. They're in the meeting, but their mind is somewhere else. So again, just examples to keep in mind of work avoidance, so that when you find yourself saying, gee, what's happening here? You can look at people's behavior and try to find a way to get them back into the conversation. So what I want to do is shift gears now. It's about 4:17, and let's take some questions from folks on the call. You've been listening very patiently. I'm sure there's a lot you'd love to share and questions to ask. So we'll just take some questions here in the chat section and try to respond to them the best that we can. And they could be about Colorado. They could be about the framework, about Massachusetts, whatever's on your mind. And so while you think about that, I'll just go back to Margot's observation on loss, that if you have, there's certain aspects of, in this case, the national model and the fidelity to that model, that if you lost, you would really lose the original intent of the work. And so, Margot, as I was saying in my response to you here, that is sometimes the difficult part in that first step of adaptation, is identifying what really is critical to who we are. If we stop doing, we'd be done. We would cease to be what we're about, and what's not. And the hard part there is that everyone's going to have a different opinion about that. And what might be 5% for you of loss, giving things up, could be someone's entire life and entire career. So that's a really good point you make there. And that's why leadership, in our experience, is really difficult and sometimes even dangerous. Caitlin has a question here. Can you give more examples of how to energize, motivate people falling into some of those common categories of work avoidance? Yeah, and I would love to have examples from the group here. I think there's a myriad examples of ways you can energize and motivate people. I think the one that you tend to find most often is folks will speak to the purpose. And I think you guys did some of this. Why are we here? What's this about? Why is this important? What's the gap between where we are and where we need to be? That kind of motivation is what you would typically think about. And I think it's very powerful. The other kind of motivation to think about, which maybe is less comfortable for folks here, is thinking about those losses again. And this is why they're so important. So when people are, if they're afraid of losing something, and you press on that loss, if they're afraid that the work you're going to do is going to impinge upon their relationship with a community stakeholder, for example, that loyalty they feel to that stakeholder, and you press on that loyalty, right? You're going to get people's attention. Not in a way that they quite like, but you're going to get their attention, get them in the game, back at the table with some stakes and willingness to engage. So there's both the kind of appeal to purpose piece, and there's a trying to diagnose the loss that folks are going to deal with, and using that both as a way to pace them through the loss and to bring them back into conversation. And it's why we often talk about leadership as both a diagnostic act and a kind of action-oriented set of behaviors. That diagnostic work up front is really critical. And the information on work avoidance was most interesting. Can you direct us to resources for dealing with this issue? Yes. Why don't we do that? I'll make sure that Holly has some resources that you can read afterward on work avoidance. Other questions, observations, comments?
If it's okay, this is Mary, and I'll jump in there. I think, what keeps jumping into my mind is this idea of trust, and the idea that it starts with us as the state leads to reach out in that way, or maybe to look at what we really understand about trust in accomplishing this. Right,
right. So the trusting relationships as an aspect of bringing people back to the conversation, motivating them. It sounds like, Mary, you've done a lot of that work in Colorado, and you can lean on that when you're asking people to give something up in the service of progress. And we can come back to this trust component. I think if folks here see trust as a critical part of what they're doing, we can talk more about what that looks like. Patty, you say that we often say that we make progress in small steps, but we try to celebrate and recognize when we do make those small steps. I think that's an important point. It's both the celebration of the small steps and the success, and a celebration of the learnings and the failures. I think the kind of work you're all doing does require a degree of risk-taking, and so one thing we often encourage people to do is to go on a kind of tour and talk about what didn't work, and what did they learn from that. I think, Karen, maybe you made the point earlier on that or maybe it was someone else, but that we often learn most from our failures. I think that's certainly very true.
And this is Karen again. I think there was a point at which many people sort of articulated a concern about trust. You don't trust us, we don't trust you, and or everyone felt that they were not being trusted, although the people felt that they were trusting the other party. And so I think that required on our part really examining why do they feel that we don't trust them. Mm-hmm. And I think it did have to do with not meeting each other's expectations.
Right. Right, and it's something we talk about a lot. Yeah, here we go. That whenever you hear people talk about trust, anyone on this call, what I would encourage you to do is to think about trust not as some pie in the sky value that we should all aspire to, but as a process of meeting people's expectations. I think that's well said, Karen. And what do I mean by that? So when you're delivering to people exactly what they want of you, right? When you're not asking them to take any loss, to experience any disequilibrium, to give anything up, to feel uncomfortable, to be incompetent for a while, when you're just giving people what they want, which oftentimes is let me show up the way I want to, bring my expertise, get recognized, get paid, they're going to trust you. They're going to trust you. And so we think of trust as kind of a contract for services. You meet my expectations of you, and then I trust you. It's a pretty simple contract. The difficult part when it comes to leadership, as we think about it, and again, I know this is a different notion of leadership, so I just ask you to rent it, not buy it, but that when you think about leadership, what you're asking people to do is something that they really don't want you to do oftentimes when you're dealing with adaptive work. And the way that resistance shows up is they say, I don't trust you anymore, right? And what they really mean by that is you're not providing me, you're not meeting my expectations for direction, protection, and order. In other words, you're not being clear about what the vision is, about where we're going. You're not protecting my voice. You're not protecting how I want to show up in the world, my resource base, whatever it might be. And you're not giving me any sense of how I'm supposed to relate to other folks. And oftentimes, back to the question that Ann had a moment ago, I think, of how do you raise the heat? How do you get people back in that productive zone? If you remove direction, if you remove protection, if you remove order, right? If you actually create more ambiguity, that will actually raise the heat significantly. And it's a dangerous thing. You should be careful when you do it. But that's also a very effective technique. When you do that, though, be prepared for people to say they don't trust you. Conversely, if you want to build trust with folks, it's pretty straightforward. You just need to meet their expectations, as you were saying, Karen. Figure out what they expect of you and deliver on that with a high degree of competence and efficiency. And sure enough, they'll start to trust you. So trust is one of those concepts that kind of sounds great, we all aspire to, but we don't really quite understand how it's both a resource and a constraint to the work. I appreciate you bringing that up. And again, I recognize this is probably a different view on trust and leadership than you're used to. Other thoughts, reflections, Mary, are from the group, and I want to turn in a moment to closing up the webinar. But other thoughts or questions, observations? Okay. So we'll turn it over. I don't know, Karen or Mary, if you want to do a bit of a benediction for us before we close. I would just leave you with a couple of thoughts. The first is to always be aware of, or be mindful of what's a different interpretation than the story you've heard. And even the stories on this call, I think, are just one version of the story. And oftentimes the first one you hear is the most powerful. So just as you, again, think about your own lives, think about how you're trying to move people, think about the diagnostic work, the analysis that Karen's talking about. What's another version of events that might explain not how things are broken, but why things are working perfectly well? And we have this notion that the system is perfectly aligned to get the results that it's getting. There's no such thing as a dysfunctional organization or system or family, for that matter. In some ways, the people have a way of making sense out of that confusion, the way that works for them. So again, try to understand what's another interpretation of what's happening is a question you can ask yourself coming out of this. Try to understand what's the song beneath the words. watch people's behavior. I think what I learned in kindergarten, the corollary to that is that people watch more what you do than what you say. And so I would encourage you to really be diagnostic and looking at how people show up. And where you're surprised by that, do some more of that diagnostic work. But what's really happening here? And the third idea, and I think this is really quite, it really applies across the board to many of us in the kind of socioeconomic environment we find ourselves. But you guys are all at a frontier. The question of how do you scale this work? It's very complicated work that you do. I've had the fortune of working in Child Protective Services for the federal government for some time, and it's a parallel universe in some ways to what you're doing. That you and they are working so hard to push that frontier, to move forward, to listen for what's working, what's not working. And so that spirit of experimentation, of learning, is really critical. And try to relieve for yourself the pressure to have the answers. So with that, Karen, Mary, would you like the benediction?
Sure. I had shared this story earlier, but my partner has been a home visitor for, well, I started off as a home visitor myself, and my partner is a home visitor. And what really struck me actually last week were a couple of phone calls that I overheard. I wasn't even the beneficiary of this. But one phone call in particular, there was a family that she had worked with over 5 years ago. And the father in the family was being detained at the airport because his papers weren't in order. And he was allowed one call. And he realized that his one call to his wife, who didn't speak English, would have produced limited results for the situation he was in. So he called my partner, the home visitor. And to me, it really was, it spoke to the value, to the impact of that relationship building that had happened 5 years earlier. And I mean, she really hadn't heard from him or them in 3 or 4 years, and everything was going well. But when they needed a touchstone, when they needed someone, it was a home visitor that they contacted. And that to me really grounds me in, why are we in this at all? I mean, we are in this for families. We are in this to be those touchstones. And that's all I'm going to say. But Mary,
no, I would add. Well, I was just going to say that story is really what makes all of the headaches, all of the tension, all of the disequilibrium, and all of the work worth it to me.
So thank you. And Holly, any closing comments before we move on?
Sure. Just want to take the time to thank you all so much, the attendees, participants, for the adaptive leadership work you're doing on the ground and implementing your comprehensive home visiting systems. And Eric and Karen and Mary for your time today. Mary and Karen for your vulnerability of opening your stories up and sharing your challenges today. Just really appreciate you putting yourselves out on a limb there. Just as a reminder to all of our participants, we'll send you out information as soon as the webinar is archived. We also want to let you know the special opportunity in the next 24 hours to provide feedback on your experience today. We appreciate you just taking a few minutes to complete the feedback form that will be emailed to you from Miss Africa Queen. And finally, please save the date on your calendars for Part 2, Supporting Home Visitor Competence. That'll be May 8th. Registration information will come out very soon. Just want to thank everybody once again, Eric, Mary, Karen, and all of you doing the work in the field and on the ground. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.